For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. My guest today is Jason Godesky. Jason is an old friend and colleague of mine. We met in the early 2000s on an internet chat board called ishcon, short for Ishmael Conference. It was a place to discuss the ideas presented in the books by Daniel Quinn. It was here that I gave Jason the nickname the Machine Gun for his ability to remember and rapidly deploy facts, journal entries, studies, ethnographies, and more to back up many of the positions in what we would later call rewilding. When ishcon closed down in 2006, I bought the domain rewild.info and invited Jason to help create a new online chat board specific to rewilding. Jason is well known for his essays on his now defunct blog, the Anthropik Network. A few years ago, when Rewild Portland acquired rewild.com, I asked Jason to write the content to help people describe what rewilding means. These days, his main focus is on using storytelling and gaming to promote the concepts of rewilding, though every once in a while he'll post a new essay on a particular topic of interest. It's his latest essay entitled Overpopulation that we'll be discussing here on the Rewilding podcast today. Well, thank you, Jason, for coming onto the Rewilding podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I kind of want to just jump right into it. Recently, I guess relatively recently, you wrote an essay on Medium called just Overpopulation.
Yeah, I struggled with having a more creative title than that. Ended up with just go with what it is, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to just I was like, yeah, of course, that should just be the name of the thing because people are going to search it, it's going to come up.
Right.
And of course, I read it and I was like, wow, this is probably one of the best, most succinct descriptions of this. I don't know if it's a problem, but predicament of the situation that we're in. And
thank you. That's what I was going for.
Yes, well, most of your writing is very succinct, and it's one of the reasons why I've always appreciated your writing so much. So, in that vein of just kind of talking about overpopulation, can you just describe to me what that term means?
Sure. So one of the things to say is that overpopulation is kind of the equal and opposite of climate change in this regard. When you say overpopulation, when you say climate change to a conservative, they are jumping 3 steps ahead to you're going to say that we need all this government regulation and new taxes, and they're against that. So they work backwards from that to try to argue that therefore there is no problem, so that you won't be able to say, and therefore this is how we're going to solve it. And I feel like you mentioned overpopulation, and people jump 3 steps ahead to you're going to propose fascism and eugenics and genocide, and they're going to work backwards from there to argue that actually there is no problem with population. Now, I wasn't going there. That's not, in fact, the spoiler alert, the essay ends with every problem that population signifies is a red flag for is exacerbated by fascists, is made worse by fascists and eugenics and genocide. And I start off with how Thomas Malthus was. Is this a swearing show, or do we keep it clean? Okay. Thomas Malthus is a piece of shit. All right. Thomas Malthus is a piece of shit. Total piece of shit. Always was. He just hated poor people. And he, his thing about geometric versus arithmetic.
So can you explain really quick who he is and what?
Okay. So
why
first thing that should be said
his
is that
name
Thomas,
comes up. Yeah.
First thing that should be said was Thomas Malthus is a piece of shit, and he hated poor people, just wanted to get rid of them. But in his argument for why we should get rid of poor people, he made this argument that food supplies increase arithmetically. So like think of like a linear line go up, but population increases exponentially or geometrically. So that's an exponential curve. So you reach a point where the population outstrips the food supply. And he was saying we're heading towards starvation and deprivation and all of these terrible problems unless we get our population under control. And that is why we should take all of these horrible, heinous actions against poor people. He's kind of the first person to bring up population as a problem. He's wrong in almost every detail. He's way, way wrong in his prescriptions about how to deal with it. But so like people will say, well, Malthus was just plain wrong about everything. Food doesn't increase with this linear growth curve. But if you get into the details of why we haven't followed that curve, you get into the history of things like the industrialization of agriculture, the Green Revolution. And if you're talking about those aspects of how we managed to keep food supply ahead of population, and you're not talking about how unsustainable those practices are, I think you're missing the plot.
Right.
So, basically the concept of overpopulation is we're going to outstrip our resources, and people will say, they'll point out things like, well, we have plenty of food to feed everybody, right? We're not running out of space, right? Because like it used to be like they would say that you fit everybody on Zanzibar, and now it's like you could fit everybody in Texas. But it's like we're not running out of space for people to live in. That's not like even with all the sprawl of the suburbs and such, we're still occupying like I think I've read like 3% of the Earth's surface. The real killer is 40% of the Earth's surface dedicated to agriculture. What does it take to feed that many people? And we do produce a lot of waste, but that waste is not just oh, look at this, we happen to have a wasteful system, let's do it more efficiently. That waste is kind of the point of the system. Agriculture did not create more food or more stability. It created elites. It created people who could exploit others. The reason that there is and that's why the number 8 billion isn't necessarily the problem in and of itself. It's that this distribution of power and resources, if you start to mess with that, you're messing with the basic underlying reason why the system exists.
Totally.
It's like a red flag that says this system is broken. But ultimately, it's that system of exploitation, that system of elites exploiting the poor, that is the thing that's driving all of the destruction. And the 8 billion number is the sign of how bad things have gotten.
So in a sense, it really like the population growth is like a symptom of this other thing that's happening.
Right. And if you okay, could we supply 8 billion people sustainably? We can feed 8 billion people, but we do so with a system that's utterly unsustainable and driving a mass extinction. So that's not going to last. So if you permaculture, things like that have great yields per acre, but they get that by having edges. And like you need an edge of like a functioning forest, and that takes a certain amount of space. You can't just take your most productive area and times that by the amount of area you have. That's not going to be what you actually get. So it seems to me no matter any sustainable option for feeding people is going to feed a lot less than 8 billion people. Now, you have some more options for how you get there. You can just let this go and wait until we run into a brick wall. Ask Syrians how that's working out. Or we could try to do it more gradually. We can try to slow things down. We can try to get people, every time you start a little permaculture farm, every time you go out into the woods and hunt and gather sustainably, and you're taking a little bit of load off the system, so maybe it can slow down. I don't know. I'm of two minds of, does that work? If you pull the steam cord on a train, that helps the train keep going. Like there's a reason there's a cord for it. So
yeah. I kind of want to talk about like one of the things that helps me sort of understand this is the mathematics of it. And there's that curve that's some like French word or something. I always forget the name of, or maybe it's not French. Maybe I'm projecting that because I'm thinking of the latest stone tool industry. Or that's French, but no, the lynx and the snowshoe hare. What is that?
Right.
The population
Volterra cycle.
What is it?
The Volterra cycle.
Yes. So, we're both proponents, or a lot of our understanding comes from Daniel Quinn's work, and I think a lot of his conversation around population is around that particular model, right? One of the things that I think about a lot in terms of population growth is, anytime an animal has a surplus of food, their population is going to, grow to reach that surplus, right?
Right.
One of the things that I think about just in terms of humans, not necessarily agriculture, but even like before that, potentially, that somehow, I think for most species, they're specialized. So their food sources are smaller niches, right? But humans became hyper adaptable. And so our food, in a sense, the surplus of food became the entire landscape. And what was like stopping humans at that point from just like consuming everything in the landscape? You know what I mean? Like there's, and this is where, I'm very curious. People want to like pinpoint a particular time or thing that did something, right? But like, I really think that every time I start going down that rabbit hole, I come back to this Daniel Quinn concept of the law of limited competition, right? Which says that, you can compete to the best of your abilities, but you can't seek out and destroy your competitors or deny them access to food. And I think about at some point, there was like this idea within a human or culture or something that was just like, everything in the environment is mine now.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know if that happened gradually or if, I think it must have happened before agriculture. Agriculture in and of itself seems like a sort of pouring gasoline on that idea or something. You know what I mean? But I don't know. I'm curious of your thoughts around that.
So if you look at population cycles among hunter-gatherers, extant hunter-gatherers, and what we can reconstruct of the Paleolithic, it's the same kind of idea, but there's padding. It's like bumper cari, where before you hit I've wiped out all life in this area, you hit I have eaten all of my favorite mongongo nuts, and so now you're eating bugs, and I don't like bugs. They're squishy, they're gross, I don't like them. So you have a conversation that night around the fire, like, hey, all the cool mongongo nuts are gone and we're eating these bugs. Why don't we move somewhere else to where there's more mongongo nuts? And so you go there, and so like you might be wiping out the things that you like most, but you're doing it in this cycle where there's time for them to replenish and grow back. And eventually there's a couple scholars out there who have written about conservation ethics among indigenous people and pointed out you don't develop a conservation ethic unless you fuck something up.
Right.
And there could be some archaeological indication that there were times when indigenous people fucked things up and they learned from it and they learned to incorporate in a conservation ethic. So this wasn't just responding like an animal does, but actually conscious management of the land that it kind of evolves from that. But you hit these soft limits, like, oh well, we're not eating as well as we used to, and that meant that like uh, percent body fat dropped and fertility rates dropped a little bit, so we had fewer kids. It's not driven by like people starving to death. That's hard limits. That you've gone past a bunch of safety measures that are kind of built into ecology to get to the point of people keeling over, starving to death. But with when you take more control of your food supply, where hey, I can just, if we do you want more wheat? I'll just plant more wheat. I just turn the wheat dial up. Um, One, you are now rooted in a place. Moving on is less of an option because this is where my field is. Two, you go into war against your competitors because it's not just wheat you found and you can have some. Like you invested all of this into making the wheat happen, and now you don't want to other animals to take that away. Whereas like a crow sees a field of wheat, it's like, hey, free wheat, awesome. Um, and that changes your relationship with the other than human world. Whereas a hunter gatherer looks at a forest and it's like, everything I need provided for free. That's awesome. Uh, and to a agriculturalist, the forest is one, going to waste, two, harboring all of the pests, and three, because actually growing all of your food, you're depending more and more and more on a smaller and smaller number of closely related species. So one bad storm or a bad blight comes through, and you're going to all starve to death. You're walking this rate. It's such a marginal way of life that from the Neolithic Revolution to the Industrial Revolution, we were really walking this razor's edge of extinction all the time. And so you cannot allow land to go to waste. You cannot allow, some vermin to get into your field, or your village will not survive.
Yeah, when you mentioned the thing about conservation ethic being something created
Mm-hmm.
after an accident or some sort of disturbance that
Yeah.
was a lesson learning disturbance, it makes me think of there's this concept oftentimes I see perpetuated that in hunter gatherer societies nothing is left to go to waste. So like the whole animal is used. And it's interesting to read that in certain circumstances, and then read the opposite in other
Right.
circumstances where there are accounts of, massive amounts of animal waste from hunting and gathering. And it
Right.
makes me think of bears. People think, oh, well, bears, they eat salmon, right? But when a bear catches a salmon, they eat the head, the brains, and then they
Mm-hmm.
leave the entire carcass just on the shore of the river, right?
Right.
Like we would consider that waste, but
Right.
the entire forest ecosystem relies on bears creating that waste to
Right.
exist. So, all the insects, all the other scavengers that come and eat that, like there's entire niche systems that developed based on the wake of a bear's waste, right? And I think
Yep.
about um, hunter gatherers in prehistory, and the relationship between wolves and hunter gatherers, or crows and hunter gatherers, or ravens, like these other social hunters and scavengers, and their proximity to people, and the whole ecosystems and niches that are developed based on human waste. I mean, think about even
Right.
today, like in an urban context, you've got pigeons, raccoons. Um, and so it's just kind of interesting thinking about it when for me, I have this concept of I'm really getting into calories as units of
Mm.
energy in an
Sure.
ecosystem, and thinking about how humans basically can take any calorie they want if they so desire out of an ecosystem. And so
Almost.
almost. And
Yeah.
aside from eating dirt, which even some people I'm sure they're figuring out how to do that, but um, you know, uh I mean, in a sense we eat dirt, but this idea of, well, actually, we're wasting this animal. We should consume all of the quote unquote waste. Well, then we're denying the calories to all the other species that were existing off of that waste, right? Like,
Right.
there's this weird. So in a sense, like that's actually not an ethic. That's like a continuous consumption idea, and that's another.
Yeah.
So to bring it back to the population conversation, A lot of people say that overpopulation is not the problem, but overconsumption is the problem.
Hmm.
And in terms of population maybe being a symptom of that, I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all and how that relates
Sure,
back to like agriculture and stuff.
sure. I'm going to take a winding path to hit some of the things you
Cool.
mentioned, because
Awesome.
one man's trash is another man's treasure is a basic ecological principle. Like whole ecologies are built on that, right? In fact, scavenger predators. If you're not a photosynthesizing plant, you are depending on picking up somebody else's trash. Uh, Everything else is built on that. This is the whole food chain, right? We talk, waste. This whole approach of we need to limit waste is the idea that if we could be more efficient, we could use less, right? And so we wouldn't need to kill as many salmon if we could get more from each salmon. Well, there's a so the one of the reasons that economics has the nickname the dismal science was from a book by a fellow named Jevons in England called The Coal Question. And he was noticing we've made all these technological improvements to increase the efficiency of coal, and coal consumption keeps going up. In fact, every time that we make a new breakthrough in making coal more efficient, that's when it goes up. And so he posed what's been called Jevons paradox. And it actually, that when you make something more efficient, we use more of it, not less. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it economically, because if before you could make a nickel of profit off each dollar of coal that you bought, and I just doubled the efficiency, so now you make a dime of profit for each dollar of coal you buy, you're going to buy more coal because it's more profitable. It's more value. I've increased the value of coal, so more people are going to do it. So if and I see the bright green types going down this path of we can solve all the world's problems and not have to change anything about our way of life. We just need to be more efficient. Well, if you make it more efficient, then we're going to use more, not less. You can't efficiency your way out of this. Um, and so you get to overconsumption. What if we could just get everybody to agree? Like, yes, I recognize that, you're basically setting up a cartel, right? Where like everybody agrees that they're only going to take X amount, and we're not going to take any more than that. And we all recognize, yes, I personally could benefit greatly if I just broke away from that and took a little bit more than I'm supposed to, but I agree not to. How is that going to last? How are you going to not have one person who is every single person? And that's the thing. You've set up a situation where if anyone defects, it's game over. So that one person is going to run away with everything that could be taken. Um, and so, like, say you were to take, I mean, let's just say, the glorious revolution comes and we distribute all food equally to all of our comrades. Okay, well, you're probably getting by as well as you could if you were off hunting and gathering, but you work like 10 times harder. So then why would you not abandon this system to go hunt and gather? Nobody's compelling you, nobody's coercing you. That's the way that it's worked so far. Most people are living far less than they could if they were hunting and gathering. But if they try to defect, they get killed, or imprisoned, or somehow coerced physically with violence to remain part of a system they don't want to be part of, that doesn't work for them. Um, but if you make it free and open, who's doing the coercion? For what end? Right now, the coercion comes from the people who are benefiting from it, the elites who are exploiting everybody. They have a vested interest in keeping this going because they're doing pretty well with all of this. And they can then pay people to do that violence for them. But if we're all, the best I can think of for how to make this sustainable is that we share everything equally and agree to police each other so that we all know that we'd be better off leaving, but we all threaten to kill each other if we do. And I don't see how that's going to last very long.
Right. Yeah. When you were speaking about efficiency, it reminds me of the like classic vegan argument, of
Right.
meat production being super inefficient, and if we were to only I mean, it just makes me, it's like what you want to do, what they're saying they want to do essentially is replace every cow with a human.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's basic. They're cutting out the middleman and just increasing human population and consumption that much more.
Well, a lot of the things that we factor in to get those just horrifying numbers of animal production, like, okay, CAFOs are as close to hell as you will find on Earth. I want to say that up front. But a lot of those numbers that you get to show how environmentally destructive meat production is are double dipping on a lot of things. So like
Right.
water production. Okay, yes, they're counting water that's irrigated, but they're also counting like rain that's going to fall on pastures. With the methane released. Okay, but there were herds of bison on the American plains for millennia, and there wasn't any anthropogenic
Totally.
greenhouse gases from there because there's a natural methane cycle. The methane from cow burps goes into the atmosphere, but it comes back into the soil. So this is not the thing that's driving greenhouse gases. This has been going on for millions of years, and we were doing fine.
Totally.
Um, so I normally ye olden days, you would send out your livestock onto pasture ground that you could not farm otherwise. Oh yeah, so like the feed, like, oh, all these plants that could go to humans instead, and it would be more efficient. But we're mostly feeding them like the husks of corn and things that humans can't really eat.
Right.
Uh, so mostly no. But in the olden days, you would just send them out onto the pasture land that you was too rocky or too poor, you couldn't farm it, and it was the only way that you were going to get food from that land. So it was actually more efficient, which goes back to the environmental destruction of it because it
Totally.
was more efficient.
Totally.
Um, but E.O. Wilson talks about how I think it was E.O. Wilson said that we took an elegant solution and broke it into two problems of how do you feed the cows now that you've taken them off the pasture, and how do you handle the pasture now that
Mm,
there's no longer cows on it.
yeah. It makes me think too of this. I used to think, I think Daniel Quinn's work, I think he talks about sort of like nomadic shepherds
Mm,
um, being more like levers or something in his terminology. But
you're
I
right.
think, the more I researched it, in particular, this book called Europe and the People Without History, it
Mm,
kind of paints this picture of like the year 1400, right before the rise of capitalism, which is the central focus of the book. But the whole first
mm,
section is about like what the world looked like in 1400. And it's
right.
pretty interesting to think about how, in a sense, we when we talk about domestication, often it's mostly this focus on agriculture, but pastoralism, is the same kind of idea extrapolated
Yeah.
in a mobile sense. So instead of having your food stored in a granary, your food is stored in a living organism that then you control and you breed and you grow. If you want more, you can have them breed more. You can protect the young. All these different things. Um,
Right.
and
It's hard to find an example of a pastoral society that exists totally separate from an agricultural society. They seem like they're kind of like a remora on a shark, right?
totally, yeah. And what was funny too about reading that book was realizing the like cyclical nature of pastoral societies
Mm,
invading and conquering
hmm.
agricultural ones. Just every 20 to 50 years, there's like a new
Right.
warlord that was a pastoralist warlord that would just like take
Hmm.
over a settled area, and this was
Yep.
going on for like thousands of years.
Yep.
Which, yeah, anyway, so that's a very interesting sort of thing to think about, the like connection between, um, yeah, animal agriculture and plant agriculture in that sense. Another thing I wanted to, this kind of broaches on this, and then I'm going to circle it back to this conversation around elites. There's this really great essay called like "What's in a Neolithic Refrigerator on a Friday Night" or something. I can't remember the
Mm,
exact name of it.
hmm.
It's funny because it's like an academic paper
Right.
with a really funny title. Um, I'll post it in the show notes. But one of the things they go through in that is like, what is all of the like units of energy of food that a Neolithic village would have required in terms of like grain? So they are like, okay, say like each individual human needs 100 units of grain a year. Um, well, in order to like sustain on that, like, so let's say obviously you have to plant 100 because that's what they're going
Hmm.
to eat. But then you have to plant for spoilage, because like a
Hmm.
40% or some, so they calculated how much was going to spoil of that. So they're like, okay, so then now we need like 150 units of grain or whatever, right? But then we also need to store a year's worth in case there's a famine or something, right? So then
Right.
that's 150 more. But then also that's gonna spoil a lot in like the year, right? So we're gonna have to do like 350
Right.
units, right? But then we also need seeds to plant for the
Right.
following year. So it ends up being like 450 units, um, and so this is where it's interesting because Daniel Quinn always talked about the caloric exchange, right? Of like
Hmm.
hunting and gathering. 1 calorie you expend, you get 5 back. In an agricultural settlement, 1 calorie you expend, you only get 2 back, right?
Hmm.
And so kind of seeing it in this other framework was cool. Um, and actually, I think I found it because I was trying to figure out where he got those numbers of
Mm.
that caloric exchange, and I could never find it. But I found this other thing instead, which was similar
Yeah.
to that, right? Of like, well, if you need 100 units, then blah blah blah.
I spent
Um,
years of my life trying to track down the footnotes that should have been in Ishmael.
oh my God, I know, so absurd. Thankfully, he recommended limited wants, unlimited needs once randomly
Right.
because it has so much of that in there. Um, Uh, but the one thing that I noticed they didn't even consider in there is tribute.
Hmm.
And to me, like that's, a whole other element of it, right? So like think about like the when we come back to this concept of consumption, of overconsumption, right? Like
Hmm.
growing grain on this level to sustain a Neolithic village, like think about it. If it's 100 units of food a year, if a human needs 100 units, but they're having to produce 450 before we even factor in what a military or, regime, a state power might require of that person to create an
Right.
excess for them. Like that's just automatically there's just this innate overconsumption. So I want to circle it back and ask you more about this concept of agriculture being a thing specifically for elites. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, talking about the Neolithic and how much people were making in terms of the caloric intake, consider that, factoring. So, talking about life expectancy of hunter gatherers gets a little weird because the infant mortality rate is so high. And that's not even just like they don't know how to take care of infants, because the same way that we in our culture can't agree on whether life begins at conception or birth, hunter gatherers don't agree on that either. But they don't have just those two signposts. They also have things like the first time you talk or when you're named or things like that, and that opens up this area where, you know I've read about San women. They go out into the bush, and maybe they come back with a baby, and maybe they don't. And it's not really your place to ask because there's 1,000 things that could have happened. And yeah, one of them may be that they didn't want the baby and they killed it. But there's a dozen other things. Could be miscarriage or something went wrong. You don't know, so you just don't ask. And when we factor that into a life expectancy, we're making a cultural evaluation because to them that's the same as abortion is to us, right? They think of it in the same way. Like there's these pro-life groups that will come up with, here's the real life expectancy when you factor in all the aborted babies, and it drops the life expectancy in the United States to like 49, which is about the same as we dropped hunter gatherers to. Because if you factor in abortion and infanticide, it's amazingly consistent across history. Hunter gatherers, chimpanzees, modern United States, it's all like the same rate, right? So I say you can factor that out because that's a cultural call. That's how you culturally define when life begins. If you go into that, life expectancy in the Upper Paleolithic was getting into the, like, it passed 40, 50. It was this escalating curve right throughout the Paleolithic, well on its way to what we see now, like 80s and 70s and such. But then the Neolithic hits, and it plummets to 30. Now, a lot of that is infant mortality too, but it's not just the, like, little kids that like you commit infanticide. It's 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds getting sick, dying, malnutrition, right? And we never really, so if you plot out where that Paleolithic line would have been, much of the world doesn't get back to that line until the 50s, the 1950s. We're struggling to get back to that line through basically all of recorded history. But you know who gets up there right quick? The elites. Like one of my passions is Dark Age British history, post-Roman history, and people are like, oh, people didn't barely live to be when they were 25. Like, no, actually, here's this guy who was like 90 when he died. We got in these genealogies about how old he was because he was a king, he was an elite, he was back up at that Paleolithic line. Everybody else was still struggling to get up. So you look at some of those earliest cities, Catalhoyuk, right? And we're starting to see these amazing things archaeologically of like the earliest agricultural settlements. We find no signs of hierarchy there. There's really even houses, and we also find no signs of agriculture. Like Catalhoyuk, it's now starting to look like this was a religious center for hunter-gatherers, and they would come in and give offerings. And over time, because it was such an important ceremonial center, there was a priesthood that would live there full time, and they would live off of the donations that were given to them by hunter gatherers. But then you have the shift to agriculture, which may have been, how do we make enough food for this priesthood to stay there even when there's fewer tribes coming through and giving offerings? And then you immediately start getting the city that's built around the huge central palace. The Mohenjo-daro, the Indus Valley culture, like they have these amazing signs of maybe pretty egalitarian, but it's a few thousand years, and then boom, huge palaces and things like that, right? So you can see it in the archaeological record of no signs of elites anywhere, and then boom, everywhere. Every city is built around some sort of palace. Because what other reason do you have to stick around in one place?
So, have you read The Dawn of Everything yet?
Julie got it for me for my birthday. It's sitting
Okay.
on my stand. I believe I said I
Okay.
don't read as many books as I should. I
Yeah,
need to. I
yeah.
finally got a good reading chair
Well,
again. So
I'm curious too. I couldn't actually get through it. I read about 100 pages in, and I was like, "Wow, this is so absurd." It's not that I disagree with a bunch of their points. It's that their central argument isn't as determinist as I think you and I might be in terms of societal function.
Mhm.
They basically propose the idea that humans can just pick and choose whatever kind of society they want. They don't really have this, agriculture created hierarchy. That's sort of one of the things
Mhm.
that they're trying to dispel in the book. And from my perspective, they do a terrible job because they ignore lots of evidence that does exist around that concept. It's not to say that it's an immediate thing, but that you can't have states without
Yeah.
agriculture. You can't have elites to that extent without that. That's not to say that there weren't, cults and cult leaders, in
Right.
prehistory, religious cult leaders or whatever.
Well, I've watched a couple of the presentations that they did and read a couple of the articles that they did that were feeding. I haven't read the book, but like I know that these are some of the source materials that they're going to be bringing in the book. And so like one of them, I remember there was a presentation they did where they're talking about seasonal states in the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, and I thought I thought they made a pretty compelling case for that. That in this specific environment where you have this specific set of ecological factors. You could have where you got this huge group of people concentrating in the river valley to fish, and it's so reliable that you do have hierarchy as a thing that people play with in the summer. And then in the winter, we all
Totally.
disperse and we go back to egalitarianism. And I mean, like, what I have gotten from David Graeber's points, again, I haven't read that particular book, but what I've gotten from the articles is emphasizing that prehistory is a lot more varied and interesting and textured and nuanced than we've given it credit for. And the
Exactly.
main thing that like the only thing that I will say confidently about hunting and gathering is that they don't have the very narrow, specific, strictly defined complex that comes from agriculture. They don't have that. They have everything else. They are the entire breadth of human experience beyond that very narrow corridor.
Yeah. Um, So, kind of bringing it back to the conversation of population, there's um, one of the things that you mentioned, which I'm glad you did in your essay, is um, that, oftentimes people will say, well, women just need to be educated and then the population will decline on its own. Like, can you talk a little bit about um, that?
Sure. I mean, this is a classic correlation versus causation argument, right? If you take a woman who is in, I don't know, Ghana, right? Traditional village agricultural setup. If you're educating her, you're bringing her out of that system into a more Western system where the economic incentives are different, where raising a child is very expensive. There's not a lot of payoff for it. Of course, you're going to have fewer children. If you could somehow educate that woman without removing her from that economic environment, then what that education would tell her is, oh, so if I have a kid, they're going to be out in the field by age 4, and they're going to pay off. They're going to be a net source of income rather than a net drain within 4 years, and they're going to be paying back that investment many times over before they move away. In fact, all the wealthiest people here have many kids because kids are free labor in this system. So if I want to get by and be wealthy, I should have as many kids as possible. So there is, like, yes, there's a correlation here between educating women and fewer children, but that's because you've changed the economic, by educating them, you've changed their economic circumstances. It's the economic if you're in an economic circumstance that incentivizes you to have a bunch of kids, you are going to have a bunch of kids. If you are in an economic circumstance that incentivizes you to not have a bunch of kids, you are not going to have a bunch of kids. But going back to that whole, the footprint and how much resources each person actually consuming, if in that system where she has a bunch of kids, her and her husband and all of the kids in that whole huge family is probably consuming less resources than she is now in her elevated economic status, because she's moving up that economic ladder and she's getting to be more like us, the grand behemoths that are destroying the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like one of the points that you make too is you can't disconnect. There's this sort of, the far right, the fascist, what they like blame the third world, quote unquote,
Yeah.
as being overpopulated. And then on the left here, you have people saying, no, it's just rich people over consuming. And I think one of the important distinctions or things that you say in the essay is that you can't actually separate those two systems from one another. It's part of this holistic thing. And we
Yeah.
can't blame anybody in particular. We can only just blame the entire system itself.
Yeah. So, like, go looking at those life expectancy numbers again. The United States is now totally on track with upper Paleolithic, where the upper Paleolithic line was going. You take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, most of them look more and more like medieval peasant life expectancies. So would it make sense to, if you were doing life expectancy of a medieval English manor, to take the life expectancy of the lord and his family and compare it to the life expectancy of the serfs in the field and say, oh, well, we just need to raise the standard of living of the serfs? No, the lord gets that because there are serfs. And that's, the first world lives a lifestyle that is only possible because there's a third world to pay for it.
Right.
It's no more separable than the castle and the field. It We've rearranged them geographically, and now we can align that with imaginary lines to pretend that they're separate. But that's ridiculous. The nation is in a world dominated by global trade. It is ludicrous to think that a nation is a sensible unit of measurement for anything.
Um, we Earlier in our conversation, we kind of broached around this idea of hunting and gathering and the mobility of it being a sort of environmental limitation to growth.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about, consuming nuts and then moving on to the next place and leaving, essentially fallowing the previous areas that we were consuming resources in.
Right.
Um, and I'm really curious around these notions that different subsistence strategies have sort of built-in limitations to growth.
Hmm.
especially in the challenge that we have of being humans that can convert the entire environment into a surplus if we so desire. Um, that there, that there are still some geographical limitations, but those can be based on how we choose to subsist. So,
Hmm.
if we're choosing to be hunter gatherers, that's going to limit the growth, right? But as soon
Right.
as people become agriculturalists, there are all of these economic incentives to grow.
Right.
And so I'm kind of, I'm curious, once I think this is the problem. This is where you were talking about at the very beginning with like, you mentioned overpopulation, people jump 5 steps ahead and they're thinking you're a
Yeah.
fascist, right? That's because what we're talking about is that humans have removed the barriers that limited our growth in the past,
Right.
right? Geographically, just thinking about pandemics, like biologically,
Yep.
we've removed these barriers that limit our growth. And so, if we're going to talk about overpopulation and what to do about it, what we end up, I think they're jumping to conclusions about limiting, creating cultural limitations to growth, which oftentimes would be done by a state entity.
Yeah.
And and states are authoritarian by
Right.
nature. And so it's just like, automatically it's like, well, if that's going to be done, it's going to be done by the authorities. And the authorities are going to do it in a racist way because our society is racist, and in a
Sure.
classist way because our society is classist, and ethnocentric. So it's essentially a form of genocide, right?
Right.
So um, is there anything at this point that can be, this is a two-parter. Is there anything that can be done, like culturally? I mean, that would change our trajectory, or if not, if we're just headed for a collapse and that's just the situation we're in, what do we do in that instance um, to prevent the state from sort of dictating who lives and who dies during the collapse itself, during the decline?
So I'm going to riff a little on Daniel Quinn here. If there are humans in 200 years, they will not think like us, and there will not be 8 billion of them. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can get there. Imagine this spectrum. On this side is Mad Max, right? Just we don't do anything. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Roving gangs of cannibals in the streets. Every horrible post-apocalyptic trope you can imagine, right? And the population comes down through murder and mayhem. And over here is the dream of a perfectly gradual ecological power down. It's what's what there was this whole new degrowth, right? That it has start like that's an amazing concept. That's all the way over here. We over time we start emphasizing quality of life over quantity. Uh, you know we assert those limits to growth that were aesthetic rather than hard and caloric. So like yes, we can convert every calorie into human mass if we want, but most of it's rather unpleasant. So just eat the things that you like and then move on to some other place that has more of the things you like because it's delightful, because it's good, you like it, not because you're starving. And making that more of what, and so through that, a gradual power down, a slope, a gentle, peaceful, sloping transition to a less populous future. Right. So you've got, and in between, you've got this messy middle where it's a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. I have some bad news. All the way over here is off the table. Syria, the Syrian civil war already happened. We already have an endless list of creatures that have gone extinct. There's already uh, conflict and death about that has come from the breakdown of society that has already happened. So it's too late for it to be perfectly, even if it's perfectly peaceful from here on, which seems like a stretch. But if it, even if a miracle were to happen, it's still too late for it to be perfectly peaceful. But equal and opposite over here, I look out my window and I've got this little forest garden that I started. So it's not going to be all the way over here. You're doing rewilding. People are out there moving us a little bit closer. And that means that where we're going to end up is going to be somewhere between those. And that I take great comfort in, because that means that everything I do can push it closer to the end that I want. I can push it closer to being more gradual, more peaceful, more of a transition. And like, and this is the thing that we've talked about online in the past, is that the bottleneck of human survival is when societies collapse is rarely resources, very rarely, because before you hit that, you hit the bottleneck of imagination, the imagination to think I could live in a different way. And if you broaden that bottleneck, I mean, honestly, I could throw my whole life into that, and I probably still will not succeed in broadening it so far that it's more broad than the resource. Like, that will still be the main bottleneck, no matter what I do. So I can devote my entire life to that. Part of it is accepting the things you cannot change, and having the courage to change the things that you can.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think about there's a book called Making Kin Not Population, which didn't really have any kind of like solutions or anything, but what I
Mm-hmm.
liked about it was that it framed looking at population as essentially putting it through a social justice lens of like
Mm-hmm.
reproductive justice,
Mm-hmm.
reframing the conversation from of overpopulation to reproductive justice, and not just for humans but other than humans. Where's the
Right.
reproductive justice for the western rhino? um
Right.
that
And
kind
that,
of.
yeah, that gets to the heart of it, because overpopulation is the consequence of the injustice of exploitation and hierarchy.
Totally. So um yeah, I feel like there's this emphasis, and I feel like you're sometimes like your essay is like this lone on overpopulation. It's like this lone thing that like exists in the ether somewhere, that everybody's afraid to talk about this because
Right.
of the left has this weird thing where they just, anytime the right starts bringing up a conversation topic or something, they'll abandon it wholesale just so they don't get associated with it anymore, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you abandon concepts like this wholesale, then you're abandoning um, this conversation, right? Which needs to
Right.
happen. How do we decline from a perspective of reproductive justice? If we're not talking about overpopulation, but we're just pretending like it doesn't exist all of a sudden, because
Yeah.
if we mention the word, people conjure up eco-fascist ideas. So I feel like there's this, and I'm super glad that you wrote that, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, is to sort of reclaim this territory through the lens of reproductive justice, and
And I get that reaction because there's so much bad faith online, right? And so you end up trying to figure out, is this person dealing in good faith or not? And has their hackles up, because we've all run into these people, and it's how often are you really surprised by somebody? It's very rare. So if I see somebody talk, so you end up listening for the shibboleths rather than listening to what they're saying. And sure, granted, 90% of the time that you're going to be right, but you know there's a lot of we've lost so much nuance, and there's so many important points that have been lost in this. There was a long Twitter thread the person put together into an article about disinterpretation, where it's not like misinterpretation where you just don't get it right, but you are actively looking for the worst way to interpret what this person is saying, as a
mm,
means of dismissing people, and the way it fits into tribalism, and not really trying to not really trying to understand the world or make a case or convince anybody of anything, but just uttering the shibboleths that say, I belong to this group and this is where my loyalties lie. And honestly, there's so much of that online that a lot of people don't have time for anything else. They're just looking for, are you on my side or not?
totally. Yeah. Well, do you have any other thoughts on this conversation around population?
Um, I, I agree with you. We do need to have this discussion because it's part of the puzzle. It's like to talk about like I get into I know some people who are like really thrilled about solar punk, right? And the vision it produces of a future that where things could be equitable and sustainable, but you're not. It comes from not questioning the basis of it. Like you like, oh, because there's no problem with population in itself. Well, it's a factor. It's involved. Like you're not getting the full picture. Uh, I feel like collapse is usually an intellectual process. Like the use of the word revelation, as the Greek word revelation for apocalypse, is very fitting because, like Joseph Tanner makes the point of, collapse is the point at which most people figure out that they could lead a better life at a lower level of complexity.
Yes.
And so it's a matter of figuring things out. It's a matter of seeing what's going on and understanding what's happening around you. And so obfuscation works to the benefit of the people who are exploiting us. Digging in deep and asking bold questions and being courageous enough to follow where the answers lead us, that is the stuff that really threatens them. Is it any surprise then that we happen the platforms that we create happen to be platforms that incentivize shibboleths and disinterpretation and figuring out which tribe you belong to rather than asking deep questions.
So you mentioned degrowth. Are there
Mm-hmm.
any like resources that you would recommend people check out around this kind of these ideas to further to further the conversation?
Um, well, there was Overshoot by William Catton, and man, did that change my whole perspective of the arc of Western history. Really put it in terms of the environmental relations through and through. Also, Against the Grain by Richard Manning. Great little history of the environmental impacts of agriculture and the way, the difference between Western agriculture and Eastern agriculture and the way that it influenced the different types of culture that emerged there. And also, both of them focus, or at least touch on this idea of the Columbian explosion, when the agriculturalists of Western Europe, who were running out of fuel and may not have lasted much longer had they not discovered an entirely unsuspected continent that they could burst in on. Um, it reframes it. It reframes a lot of history in a more materialist lens.
Yeah. Um, it's funny you bring up Against the Grain by Richard Manning. How do you compare and contrast it with Against the Grain by James Scott? Just kidding.
Yeah, those are very different books. Unfortunately, they have the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
name.
Well, it's in the introduction actually. James Scott like thanks Richard Manning for allowing him. I guess they're friends for allowing him
Okay.
to use that for the title of his book too. It's pretty funny. Um, yeah, I recommend both of them. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, for different reasons.
yeah, totally
Now, if we're
awesome.
talking just general rewilding recommendations, I have to throw out Tim Ingold, Perception of the Environment. I finally got you to read that, didn't I?
It's funny actually. You put him on my radar, and then I found an essay by him on I think it was either the hand axe or basket weaving from his book Making.
Yeah,
And
he's done a lot of basket weaving essays.
yeah, I reached out to him actually and asked if he would mind. His books are so expensive. Making was like
That's true.
$150 on the
Yeah.
interwebs, and I just asked him if he would donate a copy of Making or any of his books to the Rewild Portland Library, and he ended up just sending me like his entire collection. So
Oh,
I've
neat.
read Making, which was phenomenal, and I'm sort of like every once in a while we'll pick up Perceptions of the Environment and read a little bit more of it. Kind of
It's
like
dense, but it's rewarding.
David Abram's book too, The Spell of the Sensuous.
Right.
I can't. I every once in a while I'll pick it up. I read the first
Yeah.
chapter and I'm like, this is so good. Why didn't I read this whole book before? And then I start to read more of it and I'm like, oh right,
Because it's
it's really hard.
dense.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's so it's very rewarding though for the amount of effort.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
with Perception of the Environment, you should really focus in on From Trust to Domination. I think that would influence your Rewilding
Mm.
101 class.
Mm.
He
Awesome.
points out how a lot of the tools and words that are used for the invention of slavery are the same things that came from domesticated animals.
Totally.
So
I'm actually
the
writing about that right now. So
yeah, the tools that you use to castrate a eunuch are the exact same tools that you use to gild a goat.
yeah.
Latin has tools that speak and tools that don't speak, which are their
Mm,
names for slaves and livestock,
mm,
respectively.
wow.
Because Latin is awful, y'all. Latin is goddamn bone-chillingly awful.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
It's like, oh, this
Well,
is a
I'm
super
looking.
Whitman language. I get it.
I had like a whole long other conversation I want to have, two other conversations I want to have with you, but this one went super long. So I feel like I'm just going to have you back on to have a whole other conversation, and that we should just wrap this one up and have it be its own conversation about population, its own episode specifically about that.
Hey, I'm good
But
with that.
just as a teaser for those who were listening, the two other conversations that we were going to talk about is one of Jason's essays, another one that I use regularly in my Rewilding 101 class as required reading or recommended reading, is called Why Words Matter. And it was one of the more, I guess, sort of it's definitely one of the reasons why I take such a hardline stance on words myself. So I really
Yeah.
appreciated Jason putting um, this context of why we should continue to define agriculture in a specific way, essentially, and why that's important and what that means. And so we'll save that one for another time. And then, of course, I just want you to plug, your the fifth world, which is this whole other thing that you
Sure.
do, which is essentially, how storytelling and why that is important, why storytelling is important to creating a culture of rewilding, if you want to call it that. And so,
Yeah,
yeah, I
for
don't know if you
sure.
want to plug that really quick.
Sure. I'm probably best known in rewilding circles for the essays I wrote, especially the 30 Theses way back in the day. And I kept on having the same conversation with people where they'd be like, yeah, I'm convinced, but I'm just so depressed now because of you convinced me of all these things. Why are you depressed? I just said that war, famine, disease, all these things are going to go away. You're going to have to work 2 hours a day instead of 8. What are you depressed about? Like, oh, because it's such a miserable way of life. What? And I realized that I was running like you can convince people, but they continue to have an idea in their head that's built from the images that they've seen, the stereotypes, the stories that they've heard. And I came to realize that the fundamental problem here is not convincing people intellectually, it's moving them in their heart and giving them a story to follow, giving them a future that they can believe in and look forward to. And I think that we're really bereft of that, and it's one of the great crises of the modern world is that we don't have an optimistic future that we can believe in. And so the
Totally.
fifth world is my attempt to try to fill that gap. It's an open source shared universe where we imagine what the world would look like 400 years from now when we are along our path of rewilding. So if that sounds interesting to you, if that sounds like something that you would want to get involved in, visit thefifthworld.com. There's a Patreon. Anybody who backs us on Patreon is invited to our Discord. It's a little dormant as we try to work on the technical underpinnings, but we could it's meant to be like a collaborative group project. So we need creative people to help us imagine what the world would look like in a neo-tribal ecotopia where you live.
The one end of the spectrum that you were speaking of, and how to, in
I
a
think
sense,
we I think we get there either way. It's just a matter of how
totally.
bad the road is to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It
Yeah.
could be real bad. Not gonna lie, but that's like why people 400 years from now will remember us as their culture heroes and honored ancestors and glorious
Wow.
gods because we'll be the
Yeah.
ones who navigated that one way or the other.
I sure hope so. That's awesome.
So we should strive to be good ancestors, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to having a much longer and deeper conversation with you around those topics in the future. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this other super important and urgent issue as well.
Thanks for having me.
Jason and I covered a range of topics surrounding growth today, and I hope you check out the show notes to pick up the threads that interest you. There are a lot of show notes for this one. You can find links to Jason's work as well. Thank you to all my patrons for making this podcast happen. If you are inspired by the podcast, please share it on social media, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and become a patron to help it continue. Go to patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer.